Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Drew Armstrong, and I'm the executive editor of Endpoints News. And today we are going to be trying something new. Welcome to Post Hoc Live. So, what is this and why are we doing it? Well, a big part of what makes Endpoints News work for our readers is that we have expert journalists covering complex topics. And as the news cycle has sped up over the last few months, thanks in large part to the Trump administration, it can be really, really, really hard to keep up with that. Our reporters spend every day texting and calling sources and reading executive orders and talking to each other on Slack. And we wanted to bring some of that analysis that happens behind the scenes directly to you, let you in on some of our up on the moment conversations and how we're thinking about the news in ways that I hope will make you smarter. Post Hoc Live, it's an extension of our newsletter Post Hoc, but we stream it live. And in the weeks and months to come, we are going to be firing it up in response to major news like pharmaceutical tariffs that we're doing today, end of the week recaps, and much more. If you want to join us in the future, we're going to send out alerts to let you know when we're going live. You'll be able to tune in on YouTube, on X, and LinkedIn. If you're watching on YouTube right now, you can use the live chat to chime in, pose questions to our team, leave us feedback, and then we'll post recordings on YouTube that you can share with colleagues or revisit later, or if you missed it, watch it yourself. If you are signed up for our Post Hoc email newsletter, you'll get notifications when we've got a new broadcast going up. To do that, just go over to endpoints.com. In the top right-hand corner, there's a reader profile link. Hit that, hit preferences, and then you can click to activate Post Hoc. So let us talk about what is going on. We are streaming this on April 30th. It is exactly 4 weeks after the infamous Trump Liberation Day when he announced broad tariffs on just about every country on earth, set off chaos in the stock and the bond markets, then walked some of those tariffs back, and in general, upset the world economic order. Now, if you've been reading the news, you know all that. And if you work in the drug industry, then what you've been watching and waiting very closely for is another part of the tariff plan, which is to put those trade taxes on pharmaceutical products to try and force more drug makers to build manufacturing here in the US. So let's talk about what that means and what the industry is doing in reaction. I have two of our reporters who've been covering this story with us every day since it broke, pharma reporter Max Bayer in New York and manufacturing reporter Anna Brown in the UK. So welcome to Post Hoc Live, Max and Anna. Let's get into it. We wanted to do this around earnings because, I'm going to just to share a little bit about myself. I've been a business journalist for 20 years. I was at a financial newswire for about 12 years prior to coming over to Endpoints. And I used to hate covering corporate earnings because it meant that I had to get on the train here in New York or on the subway and go into the office at 6 a.m. And listen to conference calls. But I have actually really come around to it because I value it, and I think investors value it as like one of the rare chances that we actually get to see CEOs of big companies grilled on the issues of the moment. And I think with the tariff announcement, this recent cycle of quarterly corporate earnings that we're in, it's really the first time we've actually heard a lot of CEOs on the record about what they think about the Trump tariffs and what they're doing at a business level about them. So I have gone from corporate earnings coverage hater to corporate earnings coverage believer. And I want to turn to Anna and Max. What are you guys have been listening to these calls? Like, what are you hearing from CEOs and CFOs and executives about their reaction to the tariffs and what they're doing about it?
Well, first off, I'm still getting to a corporate earnings lover, I would say. I'm not quite a hater yet, but I'm getting there. I'm getting there. But I do think this is a good example of sort of what you were talking about actually getting to see what some of these folks are thinking about this, how they're preparing, in a way that as a reporter, if we just ask a corporate comms person, for a response, they're going to sort of play it safe before an earnings call, whereas investors can sort of dig at that. I think for now, we've seen about a dozen large drug makers report earnings across the UK, Europe, and the US. And I think folks are playing it safe with their communication in large part because we don't know yet what these tariffs on pharmaceuticals are going to look like, and we can sort of explain how we got there. But I do think that companies are trying to convey some sense of security or some sense of confidence that they have planned for this in some amount. And I think like Drew, you reported on inventories. We've seen a slew of announcements about re-onshoring some manufacturing. Some of that I think is because I think it's an actual corporate benefit. Some of it might be some level of appeasement to the administration, and some sort of broad speak about contingency plans. But you are hearing companies try and obviously address tariffs that they don't exactly know what those might look like. I think there's
Right,
a
because we don't know the amounts yet that are going to be like we said there's going to be pharma tariffs, and Trump has said I want to bring manufacturing back, but we don't actually know anything about what those might look like, right?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, agree with Max on that. I think it's the question on everyone's lips at the moment when it comes to earnings. Executives can't really avoid not talking about it. And I think that everyone's aware that it's a massive risk and no one's going to be completely immune when it comes to the tariffs and when they're going to be placed. But I think it's just people working out now how exposed they actually are and how much they're allowed to kind of disclose at this point without, as you said, Drew, not knowing how much it's
Yeah.
going to be.
Well, you cover all of these announcements. Like everything, anytime somebody says, "Oh, we're going to build a new drug plan," I say, "Anna, can you please write up this story about like building a new drug plan?" Like, obviously, these have rolled out kind of fast and furious over the last. But can you like, how do you read that stuff and like what's actually going on there? Are these real announcements, or we've seen in a lot of other industries, people kind of repackage old stuff and say like, "Oh, we're building in America. It's going to be great," and then you take a look at it, and it seems like some of it's real and some of it's not real. Like, what are you seeing? Everybody's using this period of time to make the announcement, try to get in front of Trump. Like, how are you reading these announcements of we're going to spend $10 billion here, we're going to spend $50 billion there?
I mean, it's a big mix. I think there's definitely some of that going on. I think pretty much nearly every company is saying that they're going to try and move manufacturing to the US. And this started with, I think Eli Lilly was the first person to do this, followed by J&J. But I mean, kind of as you said, if you break down some of these really big splashy announcements, with sort of $50 billion plus, some of this is repurposed and some of this are old plans and old manufacturing builds that they've already announced, and they're kind of putting it into these big splashy PR sort of headlines. And I think there is a kind of consensus that I've spoken to with sources that this is, obviously appealing to Trump's need or want to move and reassure manufacturing to the US. So you kind of have to be a bit careful how much is new and how much is not. But I mean, since then, even the last few weeks, there's been several announcements. Merck's, announced a new manufacturing build in Delaware for Keytruda. And other people are trying to do this through contract manufacturing as well. You've got Regeneron tapping Fujifilm, and they're doing that for the next few years to get all of their biologics in the US. So it definitely seems to be the move.
Right.
Um, but also, this is not immediate, right? This takes years. Whether it's building a new plant, whether it's tech transferring something over, that doesn't happen overnight. That takes several years. So it's a strategy people are looking at, but it's not going to be an immediate way to avoid tariffs.
Well,
I'll put
and one
up
thing I think is really interesting, like, and I think we talk a lot, like in the US talks forever about how like we're losing manufacturing. But like if you look at where advanced drug manufacturing happens, it pretty much does, a lot of it happens like in the US and in Europe and in, kind of the most advanced economies of the world. Like this isn't necessarily something that there is stuff that has moved over to China and India, and you should talk about that. But like, it's not, we haven't really yet lost, a huge amount of, the kind of advanced manufacturing that it seems like this administration wants to bring back.
Hmm. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Europe as well, because I think European supply chains have got sort of a new focus on it. And when this was first announced, people were talking about China and India more, but I think now people are moving to Europe a bit or moving away from Europe because that's, and it supplies sort of 43% of APIs for branded prescribed drugs in the US. That's a huge supply chain that people are now looking to reshore and move away. Um,
I
so I
think
think.
just 2 points I want to make that I think are sort of interesting about this and sort of the cadence of announcements and how they're being used. First of all, AstraZeneca made an announcement about their US investments immediately after the election. So they sort of recognized
Yeah.
what was going to be coming before the announcement even came. And that came up when there was a reporter roundtable with their CEO in New York. at the end of last year, and it was asked specifically whether that was sort of an olive branch to the administration, which was sort of downplayed. But I think at this point we can all sort of read between the lines a little bit. And then Anna, you make a great point about Europe. It's interesting to me, and we've talked a bit about it in Slack, of the strategy around using tariffs to, in some elements, we're seeing sort of European pharmas try and strong arm the European government into incentivizing them to stay, which, I've sort of talked about. I don't really understand that strategy because I think like from what we've gathered from the Trump administration, you're either onshoring in the US or you're not. But it's been interesting that it's being used also as a political tactic for some of those companies. We've seen the European Pharma Association speak out about it. We saw a letter from, what was it, Novartis and Sanofi's CEO, just writing to essentially EU legislators saying like, hey, look, we're going to be moving our manufacturing in large part because we don't think that you've opened your market enough for us to sell drugs here. So we might as well sort of make this move, in part because the US is our largest market.
Mm-hmm.
Max, what are we, I think I have listened to a lot of earnings calls as well. And I think one of the things that, and in some ways, this isn't different from a lot of large, US based industries, but, like trying to walk the tightrope of acknowledging that they have an issue with the tariffs, but without directly criticizing this administration, which I think, there's a lot of fear from corporate executives. Like if you say something bad about Trump, like it's going to cost you. And, we saw this recently, there was a story a couple of days ago that Amazon was going to start adding tariff surcharges to, its list of pricings. And like they couldn't, the White House called them a traitor, I believe, or a traitorous act or something like that. And then they couldn't backpedal fast enough in terms of getting it. So like you see a lot of caution in corporate America, but I think it has been interesting that we have seen some, the gentlest of pushback in CEO comments about the tariffs and what people think about that. But is that a fair characterization of what we're hearing on calls and in interviews? I mean, Lilly, I know they report tomorrow, but David Ricks was out there in the BBC. We've seen a lot of talk about tax policy. What's the tone of what we're hearing in at least the kind of first public messaging around this, and the few folks who've said much?
Well, I think as we hit on at the beginning, the tone has been tepid because the rate isn't known, right? So I think there's a ton of lobbying going on right now to try and mitigate what the tariffs look like generally. I mean, the work is being done to prepare, but I think come second quarter earnings, for example, farmers would love to report like, hey, we did all of these mitigation strategies. We're not actually going to need any of them or most of them. We're sort of in a good spot because here's what our tariff rate actually looks like if these industry specific tariffs come out. So you're seeing some jostling behind the scenes. That was sort of displayed by Albert Bourla during Pfizer's earnings yesterday. Bourla is not only the CEO of Pfizer, but he's the chair of pharma, which is sort of what I would sort of characterize as the leading trade group for the large pharma industry in DC, maybe its main lobbying group as an entity. He seemed to slightly get ahead of his skis in talking about how it looks like those tariffs might be most severe in what the US deems as sort of adversaries as opposed to friendly countries. A White House official told me that any such notion would be too early to say. So I think like they're trying to push out a message about what could be coming without knowing exactly what that is. And to your point, Drew, not wanting to beat the White House to some announcement, and in the process, whatever agreement they think they've come to is then reneged, and then it's actually worse than they thought. And I'll just sort of leave with one thing that when I sort of speak with folks around the Trump orbit or who used to work with Trump, I think there's one defining feature about him as a person and his administration, which is they use some iteration of the phrase like, you have no idea what's going to happen until he says it at the Rose Garden. So I think like everything before that is posture. What comes out of the White House is posturing. What comes from companies is posturing. Like ultimately, there is one person who sort of decides where we land, and I think that's we'll see where the 270 investigation or 230 investigation rather comes to, but I think that's underpinning all of this. Is everyone knows that if they're talking to the White House, but they're not talking to the president, they don't exactly know how the president feels.
Well, And Anna, like, can you just remind everybody, because I have asked you this question before, like how is this going to work? Like what's actually happening right right now, just as a process that's going on with this 232 investigation? Like what do we like, and what do people think the outcome of that is going to be?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, at the moment we've got this 232 investigation that's underway, and that's, been officially announced, but we don't know how long that's been going on for. So just because they've announced
And
it
will you
doesn't
just
mean.
remind everybody like what a 232 investigation is, just for, like, for everybody who doesn't know?
Yeah, yeah, of course. So this was, the products that are now being investigated for tariffs that were previously exempt. And all it requires is that Trump needs to go to Department of Commerce and say, I want to put this product in a 232. We need to do a big investigation, which includes a lot of analysis, getting company comments, just basically assessing what the supply chain looks like for the US, if they're dependent on certain countries, what their imports and exports looks like, and then he can just decide to put a tariff on that. And that can take up to 270 days, which is obviously quite a long time, but it also can be much shorter.
Right. And
And
nobody
that's
thinks
what
it's going to really be 270 days. Like this,
I
we're
think
only
it's going
100
to be
days into this
270.
administration. Like that, I don't think anybody I've heard says like, oh yeah, we're going to be doing this in December. Like,
It's 270 days. Is that even next
No,
year? Even in 2025, 270
yeah,
days?
it's more
I
yeah,
think
it's,
you can
it's
get this
just
to
at
the
the
end of
end
the
of
year.
this year.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah. But no one thinks it's going to take 270 days. And I think what on that as well, what's interesting is that whilst we've got this 232 investigation, a lot of analysts and trade lawyers also think that he is trying to put farmer tariffs on also through an international emergency economics power act. So they kind of doing this dual track approach, which means that second act doesn't need an investigation, so that can happen much quicker. But then the issue for Trump is that the Supreme Court can then review that in a year's time or a year and a half's time, and it can be overturned. So it's not necessarily seen as a long-term strategy. It's kind of more immediate. But then doing this alongside the 232 is a slightly more concrete way to go about it with a tariff. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what trade lawyers think that he's also doing.
And what do you, have people speculated about what the possible tariff rate might be? I mean, I know you've reported a little bit on this, and I want to get into that in a second. But like, what do people think the number is going to be?
I mean, it's obviously all speculation, but I think people think it'll be 25% because
Right.
that's the number he's used for his previous 232s. That's what
Right.
steel and aluminium were also on, and it's followed quite a similar trajectory so far. So I think the general consensus is that's what it's going to be.
Yeah.
Obviously, we don't know.
And I like, just for the record, if I could pronounce one word in your accent for the rest of my life, it would probably be aluminium instead of the far less posh
Aluminum.
so far aluminum, which feels, extremely American. But so I guess one of the things a question that I think I have seen come up is that, like, okay, let's pretend it's 25%, but like 25% of what? Because as we all know, and as everybody who covers the drug industry knows that, at least with small molecules, very cheap to manufacture, obviously very expensive to sell, and the real value is the intellectual property. And I think we've heard a lot about transfer pricing, and maybe pharma is not going to get hit, and we're going to get into that in a future story and maybe a future Post Hoc Live, I promise. I know we're still trying to unpack it now, but I think, like, a question I have for you is, like, it really matters, you know, what the kind of value of the thing that they tariff, maybe even way more so for almost, a lot of other goods that are actually, manufactured or consumer, more commodity goods, or that have a price that is much more directly tied, to their cost of materials, like a car or,
Mm.
Yoga
Mhm.
pants or whatever what have you. Is there any sense of, like, what the actual value of the thing that's going to be tariffed? Because if it's just like a dollar pill, that doesn't seem like a particularly strong incentive to force people back, or sorry, not back, but into the US.
I mean, there's not a specific value, but it's so multi-pronged that I think people are finding it really difficult to unpack because if you look through the 232 document, what's listed to be investigated goes so far back into the supply chain that it's so difficult to unpack because you've not only got the finished drug, you've got the API, and then you've got the chemicals that go into the API.
Mm.
So it goes so far back that nothing seems to be exempt as of now. Um, So I think that's why everyone's kind of looking at their global supply chains as much as they can. And then whether this, if this gets stacked along the supply chain because China is such a big supplier of the chemicals, which then goes to maybe somewhere like India to make the API, which then gets sent to the US. So it's, are you only going to be charged for the API or are you going to get charged for the chemical because that's not in the US? Is it going to be what's the trace of the map basically going to look like? I think is the main issue, and whether
Yeah.
these are going to be stacked or not.
Max, I want to ask you, I mean, we've been sending you down to Washington a lot, and you've been doing some awesome reporting down there. And, you were out at JP Morgan with us in January. And I think my read, and I think like the general corporate America read at the time was like, CEOs like were, like they liked Trump. Like like I think they didn't love what he stood for in terms of the RFK stuff and like, but like we weren't, people thought that like we were back to Ronald Reagan and deregulation and we were gonna do some deals. And we heard a lot of comments like, hey, like, like we can work with anybody. We can work with the Democratic administration, we can work with the Republican administration. We've worked with Trump before. And and then, they thought they were getting Ronald Reagan, and then they kind of got Bernie Sanders, at least when it came to trade policy. And it really has not worked out the way that these guys thought that they did. Has the tone changed? I mean, we're seeing maybe a little bit of this with some comments around RFK and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, the tone, as we mentioned, you don't really stand to gain by criticizing. I mean, I mean, I think some people, especially when it comes to science or some of the more conspiratorial elements of health policy that have cropped up, I think people feel bound to speak on that from maybe like a moral compass, if you will. But in terms of actual business related policy, I think people are trying to like very slow roll their criticism, but undeniably the enthusiasm has evaporated. And I think that's because of policies like this, which people hope to avoid. We haven't even gotten to most favored nation yet,
Yeah.
which would, if that goes through completely, I think that would make tariffs, frankly, look like small fries
Yeah.
in the grand scheme of these companies. So it is beginning to just seem like kind of dark cloud after dark cloud. Now, um, this is something that is sort of under my remit to try and figure out and is sort of what I'm trying to report on. But we saw that large healthcare executive order as well. That was clearly the Trump administration trying to show that it is working with the pharmaceutical industry on some of its top initiatives that it's advocating for and that they say will sort of not only help the industry but help patients. Things like PBM reform, 340B reform, a fix to what it's deemed as the pill penalty, the difference in when small molecules and large molecules are up for negotiations. So that was a huge moment where that was a eureka moment, I would say, so far in the first 100 days for the pharmaceutical industry. So that gives it a bit of a reprieve, and I think if anything is just sort of the administration telling them how you're engaging with us right now is working in so much as we're going to take, but we'll give. But I do think like that has seemed like an executive order obviously has less weight than broad tariff policy or most favored nation. So I think they aren't trying to sort of jump for joy too much based off that EO alone. There's obviously legislation that's being circulating around the pill penalty specifically. But no one I think is thinking like this is going to be a huge boon for us now.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
haven't even talked about NIH and how that might impact the startup and new biotech ecosystem that pharma actually relies on for much of its early pipeline and what that might look like 5, 10 years from
Yeah,
now.
we could do an hour long session on that. I think I wanted to ask you, and I'm gonna I'm gonna do an annoying thing here, which is reference some of my own reporting, and so I'm sorry
Please.
to our audience and to you all about that. But a few weeks ago we had a story about how to try and give themselves some buffer. A lot of these pharma companies were basically trying to get as much product across the U.S. border as possible and build up inventories. And I know Merck made some comments that they have, I think, enough Keytruda for a year in the U.S. right now. And Max, have we've been hearing some other people kind of make loose acknowledgments of this Yeah, I think Pfizer got at it a little bit sideways, but nobody wants to say exactly that they're doing this because it sounds like you're trying to dodge the tariffs, which they are. But I think we're seeing some of these, again, like careful comments on earnings calls about how people are trying to at least short-term tariff proof themselves as they think about long-term tariff proofing themselves, right?
Yeah, right. And I mean, that's inventory is just it's just the immediate solution. So I think to your point, companies have been wary of like putting a finite number, and obviously we're talking about a number of different products. So the ability to inventory one is like you can't inventory like a cell therapy, for example, in the same way that you could inventory Keytruda
Right.
or inventory vaccines or
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
like um, you know, I'll say what Pfizer said, which was when asked about their sort of U.S. manufacturing footprint, they described it as huge. Another interesting thing is sort of what U.S. manufacturing utilization is. So that's another interesting thing to watch for companies. That's sort of the share, like how much are those U.S. factories already being worked? And that's important because it demonstrates if they have to move more to the U.S., how much more, and that frankly, just in the long term, is going to be more important than inventory because if they have to withstand this for multiple years, it's going to be a function of what is their capacity now, how
Yeah.
much more can they add to it. Inventory is something, in the sense of Keytruda. I don't know if any of these companies could really stash more than about a year's worth of supply of drugs just
Right.
off
This stuff
priority
expires.
date.
Like you need it
Right.
for other markets. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly
So
right. So that's something to look for is asking companies and knowing what companies' share of U.S. utilization of their manufacturing here is happening now, in case that has to rapidly
yeah.
increase.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time. I want to finish this up by asking both of you, what are you looking for next? What do you think the next turn in this story is? What are you looking at reporting next? Where are you paying attention here for the next piece of news that's going to shift this? And Anna, I'll go to you first.
I think for what's next is obviously waiting for the 232, waiting for how much this is going to be. I think also seeing if they're going to be stacked or not is what's interesting. And in the nearer term, paying a bit more attention in terms of what companies are disclosing in their earnings call and how they're also looking at transfer pricing, which you touched on, Drew, and what we're all focused on in the newsroom, how they're going to be using this to sort of shift their taxes due to the tariffs. So I think that's kind of the main thing that we need to be keeping an eye open for um, before the tariffs, get implemented, which has been, earmarked for about June. So gives us, a month or so until that's likely to happen.
All right, Max, what's the next beat in this story for you?
The next beat in this story for me is the degree to which pharma companies say tariffs will increase drug prices, because this is that Amazon moment to me. Are they going to come out and say, thanks to Trump, this is going to be the new cost of your cancer drug, or this is going to be the new cost of your atopic dermatitis treatment, so on and so forth. That poses a political risk in some form. It also, though, we don't know the degree to which sort of drug prices and them increasing is garlic to the Trump administration, if you will, of like, does that scare them in a way where they actually sort of buy in? I think the Amazon thing is so visceral and e-commerce that maybe hits a little bit differently. But is there a right chord to play with the threat of rising drug prices that gets the administration's attention and maybe they reel back tariffs as a result? Or does that actually instigate them? And the degree to which that plays, we saw a leaked EY report talking about rising drug prices. It'll be interesting if we see more of that. When I've spoken to Bio, for example, their method is we're just going to poll our companies. We're going to have survey data that show costs increase. I don't know if that's going to strike the same as drug prices rising generally, because that's a consumer focused element of this. And I think anything that impacts the consumer, as we've seen sort of with the stock market and that reaction, that's what gets to the White House and to the West Wing.
Awesome. Well, thank you both very much for joining us today. This was fun. We're going to do it again. That is all the time we have, unfortunately, though. To our audience, thanks for being with us on the first ever stream of Post Hoc Live. The recording of this conversation will live on YouTube. If you have any feedback about what we're doing, if you liked this, if you hated it, if you have an idea for us, I want to hear from you. You can Google my name and you'll find my name and my email address on the Endpoints website. In the future, we are going to bring in some guests from outside the newsroom. So if you have a great idea, someone who we should talk to, tell me. And as a reminder, if you are already signed up for our Post Hoc email newsletter, you'll get notifications about when we have a new broadcast coming up. If you're not signed up, just as a reminder, go over to endpoints.com. In the top right-hand corner of the website, hit the reader profile link and then preferences and activate Post Hoc. You can also follow us on Twitter. I'm sorry, I guess we're calling it X now, on Link, on YouTube, and on Blue Sky by searching for Endpoints News. That's our show. Thank you all so much. See you next time.